Hello, History Valley listeners. I am Jacob Berman, and I'm joined today by David Mirsch and Edward Dodge. They have both appeared on the channel before. Edward Dodge has appeared several times before, and I'll have the links to those videos in the description, including to the books from both of them, both of their Amazon pages, so you can go check them out and get them. Today, we're going to be talking about the swoon hypothesis. Basically, they both authors, Edward and David, believe that Jesus survived the crucifixion. Now, they have a lot of similarities, but they also have a lot of differences, which will be discussed today. This is just going to be a discussion between the both of them on their similarities, differences, agreements, and disagreements, and so on and so forth. One of those clear disagreements is that Edward thinks that Jesus did not survive. He survived the crucifixion, but he didn't survive for very long, while David thinks he made it all the way up to AD 70. So, okay, then, let's get the show on the road. Who would like to get things started here?
Go ahead, David. Feel free to kick it off.
You sure? Because you've been on before.
Yeah, no, it's all right. My story is pretty quick. I think yours is a little longer, so go ahead and you can start it.
Well, initially, the reason I got into researching the whole thing was to determine whether or not what is in the Gospels about his crucifixion and his supposed resurrection could have been accomplished by human beings, that people could have accomplished the same things through either magic or whatever. And the biggest thing about it, I think, is that Jesus was known as a magician and a sorcerer. And there is a trick that magicians still use today called the empty box trick. So I think he was given drugs while on the cross. I think that was pretty clear. That's pretty clear in the Gospels. He's offered gall by a Roman soldier, and he refuses it. And then towards the end, he says, "I thirst," and somebody comes out of the crowd, puts a sponge on a hyssop branch, and touches it to his lips, and he succumbs almost immediately after that. That was when he was given a transdermal or transcutaneous drug. He didn't have to drink it. It's like a nicotine patch type of thing. It goes through the skin and it affects you just as if you had taken it orally. Then I believe he was taken down from the cross and he was put into the tomb. In order to get into the tomb, and the tombs at that point, the openings were about 18 inches by 18 inches. So if somebody was going into the tomb, they had to crawl in first, then kind of drag his body in. Then another person would, finish getting him through the opening and they would go into the tomb. And I believe that they ministered to him medically. And then they took him right back out of the tomb. Now, if you read the gospel accounts, this is all happening very late in the day when it's almost dark. And the witnesses are at some distance from the tomb. They're not right next to it. So there would have been more than several men that would have taken him down from the cross and carried him to the tomb opening. Then 2 or 3 would have gone in. They had 75 to 100 pounds of aloe and myrrh that they would have used to create a figure on the slab where a body would have been laid, and they would have covered it with a shroud so that it looked like a body was there. They probably would have shaved his beard, cut his hair, cleaned him up, dressed his wounds, and then revived him with a different kind of transdermal medication and got him out, and they would have clustered around him at the opening of the tomb and helped him walk away in basically into the darkness. Now, during that time, during the Passover, nobody's supposed to be on the streets. Nobody's supposed to be, working or doing any manual labor or anything like that. So the streets would have been pretty empty. And again, the witnesses would have been at some distance. So it would have been plausible to gather around him and help him move or walk to another place. And they would have had 3 days to kind of revive him, get him healed up, get him back on his feet so that he could go out again to the garden, tomb and be met by the women and then later other followers. So the irony is one day I was watching videos and a Christian minister was talking about you have to believe the resurrection because there's no other explanation for how people could have seen him after his crucifixion. And then he does the exact trick that Jesus would have done. This minister gets into a box. The box is taken up by a crane. It is dropped and shatters on the ground. And within a moment, that same minister rides up in a motorcycle. And that's why it's called the empty box trick. It appears that you've put somebody someplace when in fact you've already moved them out of that place. So the idea that, he was in there for 3 days and how could he have moved the stone and all the other stuff that they claim now was moot. It's a moot point because he'd already been taken out as soon as he was taken in.
All right. So can I jump in here? I generally, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I mean, certainly. So in my approach is that I just stuck as closely to, the stories that we've got while, so trying not to speculate, except to just sort of offer a naturalistic explanation behind the, make sure that offer naturalistic explanation behind the scriptures. And so I certainly agree that I think he went to the cross willingly. I think he had a plan. I think this whole thing was a plot. I mean, he's been predicting it for multiple times. He predicts his coming death and resurrection. He does not try and flee or try to escape being arrested. I mean, he waits to be arrested. Doesn't resist at all. And then, and as you pointed out, when he's on the cross, he first rejects the first offer of drugs that's given to him, the wine of the condemned, which would just be some generic drug that would have just whatever they happen to have on hand, because they would mix, all sorts of drugs with wine. It's called strong drink or wine of the condemned in the case of a person who's being executed. And this was totally common in the ancient world. So he refuses the first one because that's presumably not the correct one. And then when he's on the cross, now one thing I do is I put the women really at the center of the story. I really emphasize Mary Magdalene and the three Marys that are around them because the mixing of plant drugs and this kind of work was fundamentally women's work. This was like midwifery or weaving or funeral lamentations. There were certain things that were women stuff that women did, not men. Which is not to say zero men ever did it, but like generally speaking, the normal gender roles that this was women's work, and it was something that comes right out of the mystery traditions and the mystery religions, where they were totally mixing up these kinds of drugs ritualistically and using them in sacred roles. And again, these are women-led traditions, women-led religions, of dying and rising gods. So in my telling of the story, and I'm interested really more in the telling of the story than I am in the scholarship per se. I'll leave the scholarship to other scholars. I'm really interested in what the stories mean. So, and I'm working on this as like an art project. I'll have a new website coming up where I'm presenting this all as mythology. I'm calling it Gnostic Mystery Jesus. So as far as like the scholarly stuff goes and the technical side, the text is quite clear that he's given this wine vinegar when he's on the cross immediately before he succumbs. I mean, this is a dead giveaway that he's being sedated. I don't know why people don't talk about this more commonly because it's like right there in the text. I mean, it's staring right at you. Like it's not a mystery. It's not a mystery in the least. Islamic tradition is that Jesus, that he either survived or was substituted for somebody else. Like the Muslims think that swoon theory is legitimate. Talked to Dr. Robert Price. He thought that swoon theory was the dominant theory for centuries. So there's really nothing unusual about it. And considering that it's in 3 of the Gospels where they give him this, mystery potion immediately before he succumbs, I mean, that's kind of a giveaway that there's something going on there. So I speculate that it's cannabis. It doesn't really matter what the drug is,
No.
but that it knocks him out, and then they immediately take him down, and then they administer his wounds just as you would any person who's been grievously wounded. If a soldier coming on the battlefield who's been run over and stabbed a bunch of times, this is exactly what you would do for him. You would sedate him with heavy drugs if you got it. You would bandage his wounds with aloe and other medicines that they have, as you mentioned. You bandage his wounds and leave him to lay down for a day and a half undisturbed. I mean, it's a perfect recipe for how to attentively nurse for a grievously wounded person. Now, I think they probably did, just because the scriptures say he was there till Sunday morning. I just stick to that. I mean, you can speculate that he was taken away immediately. My methodology is to stick to the story we've got, which is why I say that he rises on Sunday morning. Again, it's all about the women. The women are at the center of all of this. The women bring him out, Mary Magdalene. And then as far as, then the scriptures say he ascended to heaven 40 days later. So I take that to mean that he died for real 40 days later. And that's the long and short of my analysis and evidence on that. I don't really go into any other possible traditions, because there's loads of other traditions out there.
Right. We're so close in how we view it. One thing that I think is very important is that the first offering of gall was by a Roman soldier, and Jesus refused that. The second one was by somebody witnessing the crucifixion who ran out. And I think the hyssop branch, is very, very important, because
is that symbolic of something, the hyssop branch specifically?
Not so much as that whoever was coming out to do this didn't want to make contact with a transdermal medication themselves.
Oh.
So
I just took it to mean they're reaching it up because he's up elevated.
No, because I don't believe that at all. I think a typical crucifixion would have been a 3-man job, and they wanted the victim to be low enough, and that usually the crosses were put along roadsides, so that anybody coming in and out of Jerusalem would walk by these guys that were being crucified. And it's much more impactful if the crucifixion victim is low and can make direct eye contact with the people walking by, rather than something more remote where he's up on a higher cross and it would take maybe more guys and a ladder and this, that, and the other thing to put him up there. I think it's just that two Roman soldiers could pick up either end of the beam that he was tied to and nailed to, and lift it up and put it on the upright.
Yeah, that might be. I mean,
there
must be scholarship on crucifixions.
I think that makes much more sense than having him be a remote victim on this, tall cross. I think having him lower down means much more. So the hyssop branch wouldn't have been essential. The Roman soldier was, I believe, prepared to hand it to, directly to him. So the hyssop branch indicates to me that the sponge that is being used has the medication in it.
And it's some pretty potent stuff.
And the guy doing it is not going to want to touch it. So he puts it on a branch and puts it to his lips, Jesus's lips, and then, disappears. And that's the only thing reason why I can see that there's a difference, between the Roman soldier and the witness. The witness is in on, the plan to have him
for sure.
And, so that's why
the male disciples were not. The male disciples didn't know.
I think Judas did. I think he was part of it. Yeah. I think he was definitely part of it.
Which is a whole other speculation about. So then, did he really kill himself, or what did Judas think? What was Judas told? Why did was he completely in on it, or was he only sort of half in on it? I mean, I imagine you're assuming that Judas was dispatched to go get the authorities to bring him to Jesus.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is a common. People have been saying that for centuries. You've got the Gospel of Judas from the Gnostic. So I mean, this is an old idea, and it's a pretty interesting rabbit hole to sort of go down. I specifically did not go down that in my book. just because it was like been pages and pages more of text that would have just, I just didn't even go there.
Tired of typing?
My book was long enough as it was. So
Yeah.
So now you go on, but you think that Jesus then survives, and the Muslims think Jesus went to India. There's all these traditions that he lived a long life. What's your take on it? Where he ends up?
Well, before I get to that, it's important to realize that if the Roman authorities found out about the empty tomb, Jesus is now a wanted man. He can't just walk through the streets of Jerusalem, preaching and being obvious and in public. He has to disappear. Sure. Because guess what's going to happen if the Romans find out about it? They're going to snatch him up and they're going to do it again, or they'll do it, a different form of capital punishment. They'll lop off his head or something.
Yeah, exactly.
So he's basically got to disappear. Now, in Josephus, and I'm sure you are aware of this, there is an episode where there is a Jesus ben Ananias. And this Jesus comes on the scene in 62 CE, the same year that James, the brother of the gospel Jesus, is basically assassinated or killed. When Jesus ben Ananias comes on the scene, he basically hides his identity for the first 4 years that he's on the scene until 66. 66 is when the revolt starts. And at that point, it doesn't matter who knows who he is, because the Romans are on one side of the wall, he's on the other side of the wall. A revolt has started, so he's not worried about being recaptured by the Romans at that point, so he can let his identity be known. My take is that Ananias is the same as Annas, the high priest in the Gospels, and that is Jesus's maternal grandfather. And Josephus knows this, and he talks about this Jesus as kind of a hick, a rube from the sticks kind of a guy, which is basically how Jesus was presented in the Gospels, that he was from Galilee, he was poor, he was, supposedly a carpenter, blah, 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 blah. He was basically somebody from the sticks. He wasn't an elite. He wasn't in any public office. He wasn't, supposedly in the Gospels, he wasn't from a famous family or well-known.
Sure. He comes from a poor family, and he's a nobody.
Yeah, he's a nobody. And that's the way Josephus talks about him, that he's a nobody. The thing is that this nobody is saying almost word for word the same things that Jesus had been saying years before. Now, I've had some scholars say, well, that was pretty typical to, cry about Jerusalem and woe be to Jerusalem and, woe to the east, woe to the west, all that kind of stuff. That was pretty typical. Okay, show me one. Because I've got two instances where a guy named Jesus is saying the exact same thing. And the Gospels indicate, to me anyway, that this Jesus ben Ananias is actually the son of the high priest Caiaphas. And some time ago, I think it was in 2011, archaeologists unearthed the Miriam ossuary, and on that is inscribed Miriam, daughter of Jesus, son of Caiaphas. So Caiaphas clearly had a son named Jesus. And that kind of goes to explain a lot of the swoon theory and why certain things were done the way they were done. Caiaphas was in control of it. Caiaphas knew how to fake the death on the cross. There were other means of capital punishment.
Caiaphas was in on it too, then?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think he raised his son Jesus, in a sense, to be prepared for this, because I think they were rebels. They did not like the fact that Rome was occupying Israel, and specifically, Judea and Jerusalem. They were adamantly against that. And we probably don't have time, but I could go into a couple of stories that are in the Gospels that indicate that Jesus was very, very angry about having the Romans force people to live in the city of Tiberias. Tiberias was built on an ancient graveyard, and Jews didn't want to occupy it after it was built. So Rome sent a legion to make Jews live in that city. And Jesus was furious about that. So to me, the crucifixion is about, the intent of the crucifixion is about, for Caiaphas and Jesus, if I can raise from the dead, that will show the population that God is on my side, that I have a real connection with God, that he has raised me from the dead. And that will inspire them to join the revolt. That will get the revolt started.
I mean, I definitely think it's a political stunt. I mean, that's the only way I can interpret, why you would fake your death that way. I mean,
Right.
it's a very dangerous thing to do. It's clearly, half crazy, or very crazy. But people do crazy stuff. Evil Knievel, like, they broke his bones all the time for much less of a payoff than what Jesus was trying to accomplish. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's outrageous. And again, I don't understand why swoon theory is not taken more seriously by atheists and scholars. It, to me, is by far the most
Plausible.
explanation you want to offer for it. I mean, just
Yeah.
it by far takes the account of the best of the evidence, and of just this notion that the first generation of witnesses had some credibility in claiming they saw this guy alive. Like, the whole premise of the Christian faith is that these people saw him alive.
Yeah.
Whatever your explanation was, I don't find the atheist line that it just didn't happen, or the guy didn't exist, or that there was it was purely a hallucination. I don't find those arguments compelling at all, really. It's not like people having bereavement about missing loved ones would have been a new idea in the ancient world. Like, that would have been happening back then too. And if somebody was, if the witnesses, was just crazy Aunt Sally, crying about her lost teacher, they wouldn't have taken it seriously. Like, the stories wouldn't have spread the way they did. So I think the first generation of witnesses did have credibility. I think there has to be some explanation for wow, they saw this guy alive after he was publicly executed. So I think swoon theory has a lot of merit, and I think the different political machinations, you've offered a pretty interesting theory there, which I haven't studied, so I can't really refute it one way or the other. It's there's clearly politics involved. There's clearly a context of the day involved. We clearly don't know the genuine gospels, because at a certain point, the orthodoxy said this is what you're allowed to know and what you're not allowed to know, and anything that was outside of their envelope of established orthodoxy was deemed heretical. So we only get one version of the Jesus story, and it's not a very convincing one, frankly.
Well, I take exception to that only in that there is a level written in the Gospels that most scholars haven't, and maybe no scholars have gotten down to. And it's this: with the Roman occupation, anything written by the Jews, and we'll just use that term, but this would be Samaritans and Galileans and everybody that would follow Moses and the law, would be scrutinized by the Romans for any kind of seditious content. So anything, especially the Gospels, that were written to hide their true meaning. So the reason people have a real problem with the Gospels and think they're way out and all this kind of stuff, because they're only reading the surface story. And there's like 3 levels to it. There's the obvious story that you read, and then there's a theological, bent to that. Okay, what does that mean theologically? And then there's the underlying political message, which is we've got to gather together and go against the Romans. We've got to revolt against the Romans.
But the Orthodox Christianity we end up with is pro-Roman. I mean, the Gospels we end up with is clearly pro-Roman, and Christianity becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire. So it's not whatever
don't-
anti-Roman roots were in there were clearly purged.
Well, yeah, no. Don't make the mistake of thinking that, like a lot of people do, that Jesus started Christianity. He had no interest in doing that. He was a
No,
Jew.
Paul started it.
Yeah, Paul started it because he was an agent for Rome. I mean, one day he's persecuting Jesus's followers. Next, he has this, vision on the way to Damascus. And then all of a sudden he becomes a follower of Jesus. Well, the best way to alter, somebody's mission in life, which was Jesus's starting a revolt, is to, change the context. Yeah, this is what Jesus really meant. This is what Jesus said, peace, love, understanding, tolerance, blah, 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 all of that stuff. But when you look at the Gospels and you hear some of his followers saying, those 2 villages or those 3 villages weren't very good to us, should we go burn them down? And Jesus has to tell his followers, no, that's okay. We'll just knock the sand off our sandals and go about our business. Or if Jesus says, never mind getting a cloak, get a sword. This is where we're at now. This is what needs to be done. His approach was extremely violent. He was trying to start a revolution against having Roman occupation. If you look at his travels, he travels around the area that is the geographical boundary of the Davidic kingdom. He's trying to get that kingdom reestablished so that he can have God's consent to do what he's doing. The covenant. He has to renew the covenant. And so he's talking to people in Sidon and Tyre and Galilee and Judea and everywhere else. He's going around talking to all those people, trying to get them on board. And like I say, most of those scenes have an underlying message of not so much violence, but of this is what needs to be done. We need to restore the covenant. We need to restore the kingdom. That's my take on it anyway. I mean, I'm sure, I could go over some of these stories.
I've been reading the Gnostic Gospels a lot lately, which is, excuse me, totally different approach. There it's all about Jesus teaching personal revelation, like Paul has very much a Gnostic experience. He didn't meet Jesus. He had a divination, a personal revelation of God. And this is very much what the Gnostics were doing, and what Mary Magdalene was, in their traditions teaching. She's the apostle to the apostles, and she teaches that Jesus was teaching that the path to God was through gnosis and through self-knowledge. These very sort of Eastern philosophical ideals of these sort of meditative self-knowledge as the path to God and the path to the divine. And this was a big theological dispute for a long time, for centuries, with the Orthodox, which the Orthodox eventually won because they are theologically intolerant of any views other than theirs.
Right.
Yeah, so it's just this is, again, I'm working on this in an art project. So I'll have a new website up where I take the Gnostic Gospels and sort of blend this whole story together. But it's a very different. It's nothing to do with any of these politics, and it's purely like an Eastern sort of meditative, spiritual approach to the theology. It doesn't actually, I do talk about that there's a political aspect to it, and that I do talk about that the crucifixion itself is a political act. I just don't really get into that. I view it as a political act against the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees, because in the Gnostic Gospels, he's very critical of the Pharisees.
Mm-hmm.
He's explicitly calling them out and like kind of cursing them.
Well, in context, if we were back when the crucifixion purportedly took place, and people came, and there was no media, there was no video, there was none of the way of capturing the event or anything like that, or his supposed resurrection, people would be spreading the word about it, and they'd be saying, this Jesus guy was crucified and he was dead, and then all of a sudden his tomb was empty. You'd have 15 different explanations for it back then. and they would all scatter and get their own believers and say, this is what happened. I think that's the Gnostics. I think, the Jews had their own opinion about it. The Christians clearly had their feelings about this episode, this event that really couldn't be explained logically. Clearly he was crucified. Clearly he was taken down from the cross. And clearly people thought that he had been put in this tomb, and then the tomb was found not just empty, and this kind of is a giveaway. In Mark and Luke, the tomb is found open. Well, you can't have a resurrection if people can't see that the body is gone. In other words, if the tomb had stayed closed, nobody would have noticed that the body was gone until, he met with other people and stuff.
Right.
Matthew gets the idea that, well, okay, but that doesn't look so good. It looks more miraculous if the tomb is closed and then people see him outside of the tomb. Then he's been resurrected outside of the tomb, not through the opening to the tomb. You understand what I'm saying?
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah. So again, you would have had numerous different approaches to what actually happened and how it could be explained. And to me, that's Christianity, that's the Gnostics, that's the Marcions, and everybody else, had their own take on what could not be explained any other way to them.
I mean, one thing some people talked about, or one data point I find very interesting and needs to be pointed out again against the atheists who say, the hard atheists who say the guy didn't exist at all or something, which is that, all the best evidence in terms of textual evidence would have been in Jerusalem, with the Jews, and then the city gets burned down in the war in the year 70. So all the best evidence that might have existed for Jesus at the time that everyone's like clamoring for, like, we don't have any good evidence. Like, well, it's because the whole city got burned down.
Yeah,
that's where all the best evidence would have been. And then they talk about, some critics have said, talk about the empty tomb wasn't being venerated prior to Constantine. Again, I don't know if it was or wasn't, but but it's a valid point that, if this was a known empty tomb, that it would have been venerated from day one, right? But perhaps it was being because the Romans, when they rebuilt the city as, I think, what do they call it, Aliena Capitolina or something?
Yeah. Yes.
They built a temple to Venus in what became, Constantine takes down the temple to Venus and makes it the church of the Holy Sepulchre. But I always thought that was funny that, like, they so what they do, build the temple of Venus right on top of the the empty tomb, or there was something to that spot. Apparently there was some reason why they had a temple there. But I think that's funny that Constantine found that, obviously took the Roman temple, the Venus temple, and there must have been these caves underneath it and stuff. It must have been a sacred site all along. I'm just guessing. And so apparently that was outside the city walls in the, in Herod's time, and then inside the city walls later on. So I just thought that it was funny that the supposed tomb, was the Temple of Venus, but that was after, the Jewish era. That was a later era. So what might have been there during the Jewish era is a little bit unknown. It's kind of a blank slate right now.
You touched on something which I think really is important to elaborate a little bit on, and that is there would not have been any written documents because of what you said, because in 70, the city was wiped out, and that's where most of the writing was. The second reason was, again, Rome occupied the whole area, and you could not. I think they declared when the Romans realized that the tomb was empty and that the crucifixion victim had disappeared, they declared damnatio memoriae, which means we're going to damn his memory. We're not going to let anybody speak about him or write about him on pain of death. They could not afford to have that kind of news get around that somebody survived.
You had freedom of religion in the Roman Empire, but you did not have freedom to sedition. And,
right.
So there was no distinction between politics and religion. any religion that was like deemed seditious to the to the authority of the state was crushed with impunity.
Right.
And I think that yeah, so anything that's politically unpopular, it has to be pretty underground.
But it would be detrimental to the fear factor that Rome tried to instill in an occupied population. In other words, if word gets around that there's a chance that you could survive crucifixion and stuff, what happens to some of their power? Do they lose some of that power? Do people say to themselves, well, maybe I can make it through, maybe I can get away, maybe, I can be taken down, somebody thinks.
Yeah, I think that's all a really good point. That in that first century, the Roman authorities would have had no interest in whatever the stories were about Jesus. They would have no interest in letting them circulate until they were sufficiently deemed to be non-seditious, basically, until you get somebody like Paul who presents it in a framework that's not going to be deemed a threat to the establishment order.
The other thing too, and this goes to why there was not more information about Jesus written down, is that there was such a prohibition in Jewish culture about slander that was a big sin. You couldn't just say or write things about somebody unless you absolutely knew they were true. So what they would do is they would couch some of those things in different terms. And one of the examples of that is later in around 130 CE, in the Babylonian Talmud at Haggiga 14b and 15a, there's a conversation that Ben Zoma is having. He's a wise man. He's talking to a couple other wise men. And they're talking about the fact, how can a high priest impregnate a woman without intercourse? And they come up with some ridiculous idea that maybe they shared a bath together and this guy ejaculated and it managed to impregnate this woman. This is in the Talmud. This is at a time when Christians were pulling away from the Jews before the Second Jewish Revolt, before the Bar Kokhba Revolt. And what he's basically saying is, once you realize that Jesus is the son of a high priest and the grandson of another high priest, you realize he's talking about Mary being a virgin and being impregnated by Caiaphas. He's slamming the Christians. And so he comes up with this wild idea of how could this happen and this, that, and the other thing. How could a high priest, because it was against the law for a high priest to marry anyone other than a virgin. So if Mary was pregnant before they got married, that was an issue. So they had to, kind of create this other story about she was impregnated by God or whatever. It's basically that he got her pregnant before they got married, and then they got married, and he's high priest and he's got to explain that. And Ben Zoma is basically putting it down and saying, no, it's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. I mean, there's also just that it's one of the oldest motifs, religious motifs, is the Virgin Mother of God and the virgin births. And I mean, this is such an old tradition of goddesses. They were called virgins. So Ishtar, Anat. I mean, virgin was a title of I mean, this is what they called, and the priestesses too were called virgins. The Kadesha priestesses in King Solomon's temple, they're doing the ritual prostitution. They're called virgins. It was just a title that was used, and so and then the children born to those priestesses were said to be virgin born. So you get all sorts of heroes and legends like Sargon the Great, who was born of one of these, and so they're they don't have a father, not a father that's acknowledged, because they're born through ritual sex. And yeah, so the virgin birth is just a really, really old motif. It just goes over and over and over again. We see it all. It's one of the most common repeating patterns.
If that was not in the Talmud with Ben Zoma, I would be much more inclined to go along with that. But I think that is a very pointed reference, very subtle. He's not slandering anybody because he's speaking in generalities. He's not naming anybody. But to me, it's pretty indicative that he's irritated that the Christians, believe the virgin birth and all that kind of stuff. And he's kind of saying, well, the high priest, got her pregnant
So wait,
somehow.
what is Caiaphas's role in Jesus' trial? Isn't he the one proceeding over the trial?
Yeah,
Isn't he the one?
absolutely.
All right, so he's the one that actually sentenced him to death. All right,
He's the one that pushes for the crucifixion.
gotcha. On the Sabbath eve at a very unusual time when it wouldn't normally happen.
Right. Exactly. And his father-in-law is there too. Now, I don't think his father-in-law was fully aware.
I mean,
But-
everybody makes the point that execution, the trial is like, the timing of the trial makes no sense. That they would do it Friday night, like just hours before the Sabbath. This is not. It would be completely unusual, for reasons other people can elaborate on better than I. But I've heard that point made a number of times by different scholars that the timing of Jesus' trial is very unusual.
Well, when you,
on the norms of how they operated.
but when you realize that there were two Sabbaths back to back, and like I said, people would be off the streets, he could push for the crucifixion. He was a high priest.
Right. Yeah. No, your explanation offers an explanation for what.
Yeah. I mean, that explains why that was done the way it was done, was because he was pushing for it to get it going so that they could do what they needed to do when there were very few people around. Everybody would have been in their homes sitting tight and everything, and they're busy, taking care of Jesus and moving him around. Yeah, it just seems to make sense.
Jacob, you haven't said much, so what's your take on
Well, I was letting you guys talk. It was all good. I actually wanted to ask something real quick, and I'll bring up something else on top of that. David, when you brought up earlier in the discussion that Jesus was wrapped up in a linen shroud, are you connecting that to the Shroud of Turin?
No, not at all. That's a fake.
Okay, I was just wanted to make sure. Just curious.
If you look at that logically, I mean, actually view the thing, you recognize right away that it's a fake. The images are like from 90 degrees. In other words, it's not an explosion of spirit or whatever, because there's nothing coming out of the head. There's no distortion in certain ways. And the face is a different length than the back is. So somebody turned and either moved forward or backwards when the image was made. But yeah, it totally fake.
That would
Go ahead.
At some point we can probably do a show just on that. That sounds interesting.
I don't have a personal opinion on the Shroud of Turin. It probably is fake, but I saw this really fascinating interview with a fellow who had been studying it for a long time. He was a Jewish photographer who was a technical scientific photographer who was brought in to do analysis himself, and he became around to, like, I guess his argument is that he doesn't know where the thing came from, but it's definitely remarkable in terms of its technical properties. And he's got the Shroud of Turin website. And he gives a pretty interesting talk because he's like, I'm not a Christian. I don't really care personally, but I'll tell you, this thing does not, it does not line up with any of the sort of technical analysis for where anyone can really prove where it came from. I mean, it probably did come from the Middle Ages, but like no one can really say definitively.
So Ed, if you were to put an exact year on when you think Jesus was crucified during the 10-year reign of Pilate, as the procurator of Judea, what year would that be?
I mean, the scholars say 30 or 33, so I don't challenge that number.
Okay, I'll just pick 30. So say happened in 30.
Can I interject? No, okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Actually, that's the reason why I wanted to bring it up. I wanted to bring Edward's opinion into here because I know you put it late into Pilate's reign, David. So go ahead.
Well, the 3033 date is based on the erroneous assumption that Jesus was born sometime between 1 BCE and 1 CE. Okay. And that he was about 30 when he started his ministry. So I don't think there are many scholars, maybe there are some that believe in that birth date, but most scholars seem to feel, according to, the fact that Herod was still alive when Jesus was born, is that Jesus probably was born in 6 BCE.
Yeah, that's kind
He
of what I
would
thought.
have,
It was like 4 or 6. It was a couple years off from.
yeah, somewhere around there, which would have made the start of his ministry at around 24 CE.
Right.
So he had I think he had a much longer ministry than most scholars give him credit for. But again, that's, how people interpret the available data. It's kind of a personal thing almost.
David, last time we talked, you brought up that you identify Joseph of Arimathea, Joseph, the father of Jesus, and Joseph Caiaphas as the same person.
Yes.
You pretty much already explained why you think Joseph Caiaphas is Jesus' father. So, why does Joseph of Arimathea also fit into that?
Well, the town name of Arimathea, translated out of the Aramaic, means the heights. And I believe that's a play on words for Jesus's real father, Caiaphas, being the high priest. I think that's a take on that. The other thing is that Pilate releases the body to Joseph of Arimathea. Traditionally, the Romans didn't release the body except to family members. So my feeling is more inclined to think that throughout the Gospels, individuals were given 3 different identities. So you have Joseph, the father, Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, as the father, and Joseph of Arimathea as, Jesus' father. This was to hide the real identity of people. This was to confuse the Romans. This was the way that they, had that underlayer of information that was in the Gospels, but that ordinary, Romans and stuff wouldn't understand, wouldn't pick up on.
What are your thoughts?
Go ahead.
Were you finished? I didn't mean to interrupt there.
No, it's okay.
What do you think about that, Edward?
I mean, look, on first blush, it sounds like, I mean, a lot of people do this where they'll take multiple names and make them all the different. I think you did this with Jesus Ben Ananias too, right? Where that this would be my biggest criticism of your work, would be that, like, you're just taking all the guys named Jesus and putting them all together, taking all the guys named Joseph and putting them all together. I don't know how convincing it is to me. I'm inclined to leave these as separate characters. I mean, other people will talk about speculating about who Paul is, and they'll start mixing him up with all sorts of different, speculating that he's also different characters. That, so I tend to take the stuff. I don't want to say I take it at face value, because I strip out all the supernatural, but like I tend to leave the characters as individual characters more than not. So, but I'm always open-minded. I don't like you've done. I don't really get anywhere near into detail on the scholarship as you have. So I'm not really going to be like Richard Carey or something and have like a really detailed textual critique of your claims, because you've done far more research on it than I have.
Another question for you, Edward. Do you distinguish the visions that Paul talks about in his letters from the sightings in the Gospels, since you say Jesus only lived 40 days after, say, he was crucified at some point, either 30 or 33 AD? So that would mean, would I be correct in saying, based on from your position, Edward, that Paul's visions are not the same thing as the sightings reported in the Gospels?
Yeah, I think Paul's doing his own thing, separate from what's being recorded there at the end of the Gospels and in Acts. I think Paul comes along a couple years later. I don't think Paul ever met Jesus. He wasn't part of that original set of witnesses. He clearly met in my opinion, he met the first generation of witnesses and they convinced him of their credibility.
Mhm.
I do not believe that Paul was among that first generation of witnesses.
People like
Paul
Jim.
has a very Gnostic type personal revelation. And it's his personal experience of God that he finds convincing, that other people find convincing, which I think is very interesting, because the Orthodox Church would come to reject personal revelation, and it becomes a chief point of contention. But Paul is all about personal revelation. He didn't even get along with the other disciples. They didn't even like him. He didn't get along with James the Just. He barely gets along with the other guys. So I think Paul is off on he completely making up his own thing. Like, he's just completely making it up.
Now David has a different position on Paul's visions. He seems to think it is pretty much the same thing as the sightings in the Gospels. David, would you want to get into that?
Well, I think I said this before.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's pretty clear that Paul's intent was to change the message.
Mm-hmm.
And so at one point, he's persecuting the earliest followers of Jesus. And then he has this vision of Jesus, hears his voice in one, account, sees him in another account, both for the same event.
Mm.
And then suddenly he becomes a follower.
You're saying he's trying to co-opt the whole project.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think he did. I think he was a Roman agent. I think there's enough there. He was a Roman citizen, and he was connected to the Herods in various ways, knew people in the government and what have you. The last thing they wanted, really almost the last thing anybody wanted, was a revolt. And here's this guy, Jesus, trying to stir up the population and then revolt against Rome. And Paul, starts out trying to persecute them and drive them away, and finds that isn't working. So he says, okay, better way to do this. I'll look like I join them, but I'll steer the message in a non-violent way, non-aggressive, non-revolt. And that's what his message is throughout his letters, is that, it's not what Jesus was talking about or trying to do. Like I said, I can give you examples of lower. Let me give you one. Jacob, I don't know how much time we have, and Ed, I don't want to jump on your, what you're saying.
It's all good.
The Gadarene demoniac is a story about what I was saying earlier about the building of Tiberias by Antipas as his capital in Galilee. And it's built on an ancient cemetery, and the Jews can't live there. They can't, because it's ritually impure to be near a grave or dead body or whatever. So the high points of the Gadarene demoniac story is that here's this crazy man, he's chained in a cemetery, and he's a madman, and people call on Jesus to help this guy. And Jesus goes to him and he drives out the demons. And during this, Jesus says, what is your name? Or the Gadarene demoniac says, my name is Legion. And suddenly 2,000 pigs come out of him and rush down this hill, go into the Sea of Galilee. This is Jesus telling the population what he's going to do to the Roman legion that's forcing them to live in Tiberias. The 10th Fretensis legion was the one that was there in Tiberias. And their mascot that was on their battle flags was a wild boar. That's why there's 2,000 pigs in the story. They're the legionnaires that, march under a banner of a wild boar. So it's that level of understanding that Jesus is talking about throughout the Gospels. Most of you people aren't going to understand what I'm saying, but there are a few of you that are going to get it. And so that to me is, a big sign of what his intent was, what he was trying to accomplish. It's
that's
just,
interesting. That's another interesting, another little tidbit you pulled out there. So the question is really, who was Jesus rebelling against? Was he rebelling against Rome, or was he rebelling against the Jewish leadership? So you're presenting that Caiaphas and Jesus are together rebelling against Rome. That's your position. That's, and you have a very scholarly defense of your position with a lot of good points. My position is that he was rebelling against the Jews, the Jewish leadership, against the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, not only because of the Gospels, but also because of the Gnostic text. The Gnostic text, he's way critical of the Jews, like super critical, multiple times, and a lot of them. And there's nothing about the Roman or the Roman Empire or any of those texts at all. He's always, it's much more radical theology. He's talking about the Divine Mother. It's much more one foot in the mystery traditions, and it's and he's highly critical of the Jewish leadership. So that's my take. And that's my
I would combine those. I would combine those. I think you're absolutely right in what you're saying, but I think Jesus was as against the temple priesthood, even though he apparently was a priest, and we can go into that some other time maybe, but he's against the Jewish leadership. He's against Antipas for building Tiberius on the cemetery. He's against Rome, and he preaches poverty. Now, you got to ask yourself, why would having money create a problem for me following Jesus? And the issue is twofold. If you're rich, you owe it to the Romans to have the money that you have. They allow you to have that. They allow the temple priesthood to be wealthy. They allow those things to continue because they could stop those things at any time. The other side of that is that, and this is why he tries to connect with the Samaritans, is that when the Assyrian and Babylonian incursions happened in Israel, both of those took away the elite of society. They took away the lawyers, the doctors, all the elites. And the only people that were left in Israel, in that area, were the poor people that were tending the land, the farmers and the shepherds and people like that. I believe Jesus saw them as more closely connected to the people that came, from Moses directly into that area, that they were a purer bloodline, shall we say, than the people that were taken to Assyria and Babylonia, who intermarried with people in those areas because they were gone so long. And so those bloodlines, when they came back in, Jesus didn't favor them as much. And he didn't favor the people that were, kind of getting their wealth from the Romans.
You should have gone to Ethiopia then.
But you know what I'm saying? He saw a real disconnect between the wealthy and the poor. And to him, the poor were a better strain of Jew.
Well, that much is in the Gnostics too. I mean, the Gnostic texts have all that kind of stuff too. Blessed are the poor. So yeah, and his theology is really radical. I think there's a lot of good reasons why. One of the things that I find interesting is, even where I disagree with Christian theology, I'm interested in why, in the cultural context of why it took off, and like why, what was appealing about it. Because I'm highly critical of how they become intolerant and shut down all these rival religions with violence and with force. Nonetheless, there was a reason why it got popular in the first place. I don't mean to change it to subject of conversation here, but like why, the way Jesus appealed to poor people, the way he appealed to women, the way he appealed to the universality of all human life, really becomes the basis for our notion of human rights in the modern world. In the Western world, really, the notion of individual human rights that comes from the Enlightenment really has its start with the message of Jesus Christ. And this was a really radical message that the Romans did not preach. They did not preach you that as a slave, you had the spark of the divine inside you, or that you were entitled to salvation at all. Women. So there was a lot of reasons why there was a lot of benefit to it. And then also it's a very, it's a renunciatory Tory type philosophy, renouncing wealth, renouncing material pleasure, renouncing sex, renouncing most material pleasure in a way that you see in the East, in Eastern Buddhist type traditions do this. But this was totally alien, in my understanding, to the Roman traditions of the day. So it's really like, I do think he brings a lot of good theology and a lot of good ideas, even as it gets perverted into an intolerant political institution. The original message of Jesus, I think there's a lot of good reasons why people found it appealing, and a lot of benefits to it, even as I'm not a Christian now.
Yeah, well, you talk about benefits. I mean, during that time, one of the major benefits, and I don't think people converted because of the resurrection. I think that was just ambiguous, and as I said,
totally agree.
there 15 different ideas of what actually took place.
Yeah, I don't think it's important to the Gnostics at all. They view it they view it figuratively, spiritually. There's no emphasis on it at all.
But at that time, pagan gods you couldn't count on them. They were capricious.
Right.
They might help you, they might not help you. The Christian God, as presented by Paul, was, if you do this, you go to heaven.
Right.
Everybody. Everybody. If you believe this, if you claim your faith, you're going to go to heaven. That's a given. So there's no capriciousness in that. There's no willfulness at the God.
Totally.
The thing is that, like the Jews of that time, the Christians took care of the poor. They took care of the widows, the orphans, and that was social security.
And that was not an alien idea in the pagan world. The pagans had those notions too, but they didn't always practice them, and they didn't always do it. And the Christians are like bringing these charity ideas back. They're not inventing them for the first time, but they're like reviving them and like taking them seriously.
Very seriously, to the point where if you get into that religion or into that sect or whatever, you know that you're going to be taken care of.
Right.
That you won't go hungry, that your children, are not going to starve, that you as a widow, will have some support. That was very important to people back then. Very important. And I think that was more of a driving reason for why Christianity grew as it did.
Yeah, the power of community. The power of brotherhood,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So to get back to the swoon theory, one thing is important, and that is that the Mel Gibson view of the Passion,
of him being beaten within an inch of his life and like bloodied, there's none of that in the gospel. There is none of those details at all in the gospel. They say he got whipped, and that's all they say. There's no
scourged, whipped.
Yeah, but there's no textural. There's no details about the extent of his injuries at all. And they don't seem anything unsurvivable at all.
And what really transpired was a lot less than even a Roman scourging. Back in 31 CE, Tiberius had Sejanus kicked out. And at that time, Sejanus was anti-Semitic and he was problematic. And so, Tiberius got rid of him, had him commit suicide or whatever, and his family. But at that point, Tiberius sent a decree to the entire Roman Empire, to the officials of the Roman Empire. And the decree was respect the local customs. So my own feeling is that when the Jews say to Pilate, you'll be no friend of Caesar's if you don't do what we want you to do, that's what they're talking about. Caesar has said, respect our customs, and if you don't respect our customs, then you won't be a friend of Caesar's. And Pilate probably was put in power by Sejanus. So when Sejanus was killed off and gotten rid of, Pilate would have been pretty nervous about how he came across to Tiberius. So what I think happened is that Jesus didn't get a Roman flogging. He got a Jewish flogging, which was a whole different ballgame. It was a short paddle with short straps. When they whipped you with it, the straps were not supposed to come around your side. If at any time you soiled yourself or whatever, They stopped the beating. You could only get 39 lashes as prescribed by Hebrew law. So this is why when the Roman soldiers come back to Pilate and say, he's dead, that Pilate is surprised.
Right.
It's like, what? You just put him up on the cross. He wasn't beaten that badly.
Right.
And all of a sudden he's dead. Go back and stick a spear in him to check, not to kill him, but to just poke him to see if he responds to it. And they get out water and blood. And real quickly, this is where the Christian apologists drive me really crazy. So they come up with this, well, the spear must have gone into the heart, to the pericardium, and that's where the fluid came from. Well, I had open heart surgery, and as a result of that, I had pericardial effusion. So I learned a few things about the pericardium. If you hold your fist up, that's about the size, of your heart,
right,
against your chest. Unless you have abnormally small hands or really big hands, that's the size of your heart. And if you go and pour 3 tablespoons of water over your hand, that's the amount of fluid that's in the pericardium. It's not a lot of fluid.
right.
So the only way, so the Christians came up with this, well, he must have had pericardial effusion, which would have produced more fluid. Okay, well, you have to have a pretty severe injury to your heart for it to become that way. Then they say, well, maybe he fell over on his face and it hurt his heart. Okay, no, because then every NFL player that you've ever seen would have pericardial effusion because they're always banging into each other and slamming each other to the ground. No, it doesn't work that way. Mine was from, they cut open my heart. Car crash victims with chest trauma develop pericardial effusion. You don't get it from just falling on your face. So you get so many, you hear so many stories that haven't been very well researched. And supposedly they have medical doctors that claim that this is what happened and that is what happened. And a lot of it is just complete nonsense.
I think back to the original point you made about the passion plays. I mean, the apologists routinely make these claims that there's no way, he could have survived these, the level of beating. And then I went back to read the Gospels myself, and I was like, man, there's just none of those details are there at all. And it's purely just tradition. And when you just look at the story on its face, there's nothing all that severe. I mean, they're bad injuries. I wouldn't want to have them, but it's no worse than you would get on a battlefield or in a car crash. And people survive those kinds of injuries all the time if they've got good medical attention.
The story that I come up with all the time on this, I don't know if you ever heard about the guy that was hiking in Utah in Blue John Canyon. And this was some years ago. They made a movie about it called 127 Hours.
Yeah. We had to
and
cut
this
off
guy,
his hand.
He cut off his arm.
Right.
He cut off his hand. He cut off his arm.
With like a Swiss Army knife or something.
With a pocket knife. Humans, when they're in real stressful situations, can do things physically that you wouldn't think would be possible. So for Jesus to survive some nails, and basically 39 stripes of a Hebrew or a Jewish, flogging, not that tough to believe.
Yeah.
If somebody can go out, and cut off his arm and walk for a few miles to get help, I'm guessing Jesus could have handled this stuff. Physically, he would have been okay.
I agree. And I'll just repeat myself. We should probably wrap it up, I guess. But the notion that swoon theory is not taken more seriously baffles me intellectually. The way that the scholars just dismiss it so out of hand, and the apologists too. Like, it just doesn't. I mean, I understand why the evangelical apologists, but like, why a literal? Like, I grew up in a very liberal church where we would have been open-minded to these kinds of things, and I just don't see why people don't talk about it more or take it more seriously.
Yeah, I'm with you. They give it such little account. They don't really even study it. They don't even study their refutation very well. I'm looking at a sheet from Gary Habermas from 25 years ago on his book on the historical Jesus. And every one of the three major refutations he makes against the swoon theory can be explained. There's no problem with it. I'm with you.
Yeah,
It
and
should be
nobody
taken
talks
much
about
more
it being
seriously.
drugs. Like, how can you not see the wine vinegar as like a drug?
Yeah.
Well, what else is it? Like, it's not lemonade, it's clearly a euphemism for something unpleasant. Like, it doesn't taste good. Whatever wine vinegar is, it's not a refreshment. It's not tasting good. It's a medicine. It's like they're slipping him a Mickey. Like, they're knocking him out with a sedative.
Well, the amazing thing is that there
Bill
are
Cosby wanted the recipe,
there are accounts where they actually put a soporific in the gall to ease the suffering of the crucifixion victim.
Yeah,
So
the
the-
wine of the condemned.
The Romans did that. So
Yeah,
it's like,
there was an
what's
expression.
your
for
problem
it.
here? Yeah. I'm with you.
So, all right. Well, hey, Dave, this has been fun. And Jacob.
Yep.
Yeah. So if this isn't going live, then hopefully my new website will be ready, thelostgoddess.io, that I'm working on right now. If you go to it today, it's not, it's all the old junk, but the new website's coming up, and I'll have my Gnostic Mystery Jesus is what I'm working on right now.
I'll be sure to have everything in the
Take a look
description.
at it.
Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you, Jacob.
Yep. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.